Often when businesses merge, we're told of all the upsides that will come with it, with little talk of the potential problems that will follow. Not long ago I talked with Austin Yenne about the problems farmers face when agriculture businesses merge. Recently, Vanessa B over at Current Affairs wrote an excellent article about the problems we're currently facing with other businesses rapidly merging. So I decided to reach out to her to hear more about her thoughts on this. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So there's a joke going around asking where you were radicalized, basically in reference to what first got you interested in politics. So where were you radicalized?
I sort of had an unusual path. I really did a lot of soul searching while I was in law school. I entered law school when I was 20 years old, and before that I had just lived, at home with my mom and stepdad, who are evangelical Christians and conservatives, and so that's kind of where I was coming from. It was just really easy to just adopt my parents' beliefs and not give it much more thought. But once I went to law school and was kind of away from home from the first time, I really kind of started digging deep into what my actual belief system was. And it helped that I was, law school is an environment where you're encouraged to ask questions, to challenge the status quo, to challenge your assumptions. So I did a lot of that, and then I left law school less conservative than I was going in. Definitely left as an atheist, which I think helped with my politics. But then I feel like my real political education really began after I graduated law school. So I moved down to Washington, D.C., and I joined a local reading group for Jacobin magazine, and that plugged me in with a lot of local radicals, activists, organizers. And so I really became plugged in, and then we have so many protests here literally every day, and even during the Obama administration, if you were a leftist. So I ended up going out to those a lot, and that's kind of how I got here.
What led you down to the path to end up where you are now, working for Current Affairs on the side, I should say, because obviously you practice law as your main career?
I do. Yeah, I do. Nathan reached out to me independently on social media. I can't even remember if we had friends in common at the time, but he saw that I was a loudmouth. He thought I seemed interesting, and so he encouraged me to pitch, and eventually I did. So I wrote my first piece for Current Affairs. It was published on August 1st, 2017. I wrote something about Airbnb and arbitration clauses, and we got along great. So I was happy to join the editorial staff a few months later.
What do you exactly do for Current Affairs? Do you just write?
Yeah, I wear a lot of hats. I mean, we're like a small enterprise. So my official title is I'm a social media editor. So whatever parts of the Current Affairs Twitter account you hate, I'm probably the one who tweeted it. But I also do writing for the magazine. I help with, as part of the editorial staff, we review pitches together. Sometimes we edit articles that come in. So there's a lot of that. And then I'm one of the members of the rotating cast of podcasters for the new Current Affairs podcast. So I've been doing that as well. And it's been a very fun ride.
Earlier this month, you wrote a piece on Current Affairs called The Rules of Monopoly. What motivated you to write that?
I mean, in my day job, I do consumer finance, so I spend a lot of time thinking about very large corporations and the power that they have over consumers. That's a big part of my day job. But, just generally, I remember when there was the Martin Shkreli scandal with his hedge fund driving up the price of, was it the EpiPen? Was that him? I think that was him.
Yeah, the farmer bro. That's who you're referring to, right? The farmer bro?
Yeah, exactly, the farmer bro. Thinking about seeing things like that in the news. I went to one of the so-called top law schools, and so a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends will sometimes get on social media and say things like, super proud to have worked on the merger of X-conglomerate with X-conglomerate. And it's like they're proud of their individual work, but they have no idea about, it's like they don't really have an understanding of the larger context in which their work is happening and the effect of the merger that they worked on regular folks. And it's a sort of complicated topic, and I felt like it's something that the left should care about, and maybe a reason why not enough of us care about it is because it sounds like it's too hard to understand. So I wanted to write a piece that kind of laid the groundwork about why you should care about these mergers and what these mergers mean in the larger context of our particular political economy.
So you open your article talking about the original version of the board game Monopoly, the popular game that we all grew up with. What is the difference between the first creation of the game that you're talking about and the game that we know as it is now?
Oh, yeah. The origin of the game is, really fascinating. It was invented by this progressive lady whose name was Lizzie McGee. And Lizzie McGee was really into an economist and philosopher whose name is Henry George. And Henry George wrote a book in 1879 that sort of took the nation by storm. It was called Progress and Poverty. And it talked about a lot of things, but it included this big idea, which was to impose a land value tax that would essentially keep land in the hands of the public while allowing structures to be owned privately. And the idea is that this would lead to a more progressive economy. And so Lizzie McGee was a huge fan of Henry George, and she wanted his idea to not only live on, but to be understood by the next generation. And she felt like the best way to do that was through a game. So she designed what was originally called the landlord's game with two sets of rules. The first set of rules had the goal of basically encouraging the players to hoard cash and property to win. And that's the version of the game that we know now. The second set of rules is that at any time during a game, you could introduce the single tax rule, which completely kind of changed how the game worked. Essentially, you had to pay a lot of money into the treasury before being able to accumulate private property. And then the goal of the second set of rules was to encourage players to cooperate with each other and also to actually eradicate monopolies so that everyone would be able to access more public services and higher wages together. And Lizzie McGee's hope was that the children would play both versions of the game and that their natural instinct would lead them to conclude that the second version of the game was more fair and that the world should also be more fair. But unfortunately, Lizzie McGee sold the patent to the game for $500 to a large gaming company, and they repackaged it and popularized the game under the monopolistic set of rules that we play now.
So it's fair to say that we don't have that tax rule in today's Monopoly game.
We don't, and it's so unfortunate. Her version sounds fun and much less competitive. And I don't just say that because I'm so terrible at actually playing Monopoly.
I'll take your word for it. So, in your article, you talk about we're in now a second Gilded Age. What are the similarities between now and the first Gilded Age?
I'm not sure there's much of a difference. So the first Gilded Age, I think the first Gilded Age started in the second half of the 19th century, but it came at the tail end of a period of aggressive industrialization and globalization, which in turn came with a good measure of accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. And Congress caught on, members of Congress caught on that these massive trusts, these really large corporations, would be able to exercise a tremendous amount of economic and political power that would, help drive inequality if allowed to grow unfettered. So they understood that to share a monopolistic firm was almost to be a king of swords, which was very, anti-American. And the senators who pushed for these measures the hardest, so including Senator Sherman and Senator Bland, what they worried about was that the effect of monopolies would be to crush small business. And they worried about things like cartels So in 1890, Congress managed to pass the Sherman Act to restrict the growth of monopolies nationwide, but also with foreign entities. And then in 1914, they passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which had more specific prescriptions with respect to controlling monopolies. And the Clayton Act specifically targeted anti-competitive arrangements and also certain mergers and acquisitions. And importantly, the proponents of the Sherman Act were also very insistent that the statute should not be used to target labor organizing. That's kind of how we got from the Gilded Age to the passage of these antitrust laws that became the pillar of antitrust.
Now, you've mentioned Congressman, or Senator Sherman, I should say. Wasn't he a Republican?
That's a good question. I think he might have been. And you've asked about the difference between the last Gilded Age and this Gilded Age. And, that's part of it. The fact that being conservative back then wasn't inconsistent with wanting a sort of more egalitarian market, a market in which we wouldn't have titans exercising so much power, which I think is kind of a stark difference with today. Typical Republican is, understood to be very pro-business, very anti-regulation. It's part of their whole shtick. And honestly, the Democrats have also been really eager to adopt a similar stance and to present themselves as just as pro-business as the Republicans. So I would say that's a pretty stark difference to me.
You've mentioned these laws are antitrust laws. So what exactly is antitrust? What does that mean? What is a trust, and why do we call it antitrust?
Right. So these large corporations like Standard Oil and American Tobacco, I think in terms of corporate law, they were organized as trusts, which is, it just describes the organization of the corporation. But it came to mean, a corporation of a certain size with a certain amount of power over the market. And so any trust really meant to refer to a set of laws and regulations aimed at avoiding the accumulation of power and capital in a particular industry in the hands of just one or two corporations. And in this context, when we talk about the antitrust laws, states have their own, but we're really talking about the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act. We used to have the Glass-Steagall Act, which applied to banks, but that was repealed in 1999, I believe, at the end of the second Clinton term.
So when a business wants to merge, is there any review they have to go through before doing so?
They do. In some contexts, they have to ask permission from the federal government to merge. The federal government asks questions that pertain to... Essentially, the federal government is in charge of trying to assess what the effect of the merger will be on the market, but in a very specific way. So there's not really a focus on whether there will be negative effects on the labor market, which we know is a side effect of a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Instead, the government will ask about the effect on prices. It will often condition its approval on the condition that once the merger or the acquisition occurs, you have to sell, or prior to the merger, you have to sell an entity or two, like a subsidiary of the company, to make sure that we keep some competitors in the market. Sometimes the government will ask companies to speak to the effect of the merger or the acquisition on the price of a product or service for consumers. But honestly, there are many instances where it will be pretty clear that permitting this merger or the acquisition will result in higher prices for consumers, and they will still get approved. So it's hard to say how much weight to really give the assessment. It's hard to say whether, for instance, the FTC operates on the basis of knowing that it's going to approve the merger and that it's just sort of going through the motions. That's sort of how I understand it.
When a business wants to merge, they often say they'll become more effective. If that's true, wouldn't we want that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a world in which we think certain things should happen if there was a merger. You know, in a perfect market, we could imagine how prices would go down. Prices would go down to produce a certain item, and then those lower prices would be passed on to consumers. There's a world in which we can imagine that there would be increased productivity because now that we have one company instead of two, everything is more streamlined. It's also true that, you know, there may be more opportunities to organize labor in a larger organization than there is in a mom-and-pop shop. And so maybe we want larger companies to prop up. But the data sort of says otherwise. You know, the data says that we see less innovation the more a market becomes concentrated. We see higher prices. We see fewer options for consumers, but also fewer options for workers. We see actual layoffs, and those layoffs help create a pool of, it helps maintain a pool of unemployed people who might be able to settle for much worse work conditions if they become desperate enough to find work. So, and then on the consumer side, you know, we see higher prices, sometimes price spikes that really can endanger people's lives. So in my article, I give the example of the EpiPen, which went up by 500% in a matter of, 5 to 6 years. The price of the EpiPen, which is an anaphylactic drug for people with severe allergies, so it went up to $600. That means that we can imagine lots of families went without this life-saving drug. So so there's a pretty big gap between what should happen, what actually happened. Another thing that I don't talk about in my essay, but that is currently a topic of interest in the antitrust world, is also the effect of monopolization in the tech world. So we have companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter that have so much of our data. They're gathering it. They're making money off of it. Their profits aren't necessarily being passed down to the people using their platform, So Facebook may make money off of, selling market data that is gathered on your habits because you've logged on every day for the last 6 years or whatever, but it's not like they get to capitalize on it and we don't. We don't have control over this personal data. They're out there providing our data to law enforcement authorities, sometimes with our knowledge, sometimes not. That's also detrimental to consumers, to our privacy. So I think there are lots of reasons why we should be mindful about size. And I think one last thing I will add is that another perfect example of this is the financial crisis of 2008. We had all these companies that were too big to fail because they're so spread out over so many states, over so many countries, that one of them collapses and it shakes up the entire market. One of them collapses and thousands of people lose their jobs or their homes. It's insane. It's like we're being held hostage in a way because they have become such large conglomerates.
You're obviously talking about the banks, right?
Yes, the banks, but it wasn't, it was the banks, but it was also AIG, which is an insurance company. And that's the other thing, right? It's industries that are very tied up with other industries. So one falls and maybe another large player is now threatened as well.
Another argument I often hear is for the push for mergers is that why would we want to punish a business for being successful, and that it would motivate the other businesses to, want to catch up to them and try to innovate. Is that a logical argument?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm actually currently working on an article for the next issue of Current Affairs on innovation and really this exact question of whether we need these corporate titans to innovate, to drive people to create, to drive productivity. My hunch is that we don't. I think that, you can certainly look at companies Apple and Google, and it would be hard to argue that they haven't in many ways helped make our lives much easier and much more convenient. But the idea that they need to be this big to do it, the idea that their CEOs need to make X thousand times what the lowest paid person at the company makes in order to drive that innovation is baffling to me, and I don't think the data supports it. I think that we would be able to see equal, if not superior, amounts of innovation in a system in which companies were not allowed to be so large, and perhaps in a system in which these companies weren't necessarily in the hands of the private sector or of one or two people, but something, closer to, essentially, like, what I'm arguing is that we could see innovation, productivity, all these positive aspects, we could have that in a more socialist economy.
So you were talking about one or two people owning the market. So obviously a monopoly is someone owning that specific market. So with two or more, we often hear about monopolies and oligopolies. Can you tell me what those are?
So monopoly isn't related. It's not a product of it's not like a form of monopoly exactly. What monopoly means is that it's related to the labor market. So it just means that it's a concentration of market power that results in fewer firms. That number, there's not like a set floor, but in fewer firms in an industry or in a geographical area, and that in turn having these sort of negative impacts, like giving workers fewer places to work, either in their industry or in their town. And then there are sort of related effects that trickle down from monopoly, just because we have fewer firms being able to exercise so much power on workers in a particular area. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what exactly is an oligopoly then?
Okay, let me take it back. So in my piece, I use this very convoluted phrase over and over again. I keep using the phrase, I'll keep saying corporations with concentrated market power. And the reason why I do that is that there are actually very few monopolies, like very few true monopolies, where one firm has like close to 100% control production of a product or provision of a service. So I understand an oligopoly to be closer to what we're experiencing in our current political economy. So in the tech sector, there are only so many powerful social media firms. You have, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat. I guess you used to have Instagram, but they got bought up by Facebook. But I would say that, for instance, the social media sector is, like, the form of that market is an oligopoly, because there are so few large players that kind of just dominate, and it's very hard to compete with them in, like, a serious manner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so just to, make sure I'm understanding you here. So monopolies refer to labor, right? And oligopolies refer to very few competition. So a very concentrated market, like you were just referencing with the tech market.
That's right.
Okay.
The social media market. I hope I'm explaining it right. I mean, there's probably an expert listening to this interview right now just yelling at their phone, and if so, I apologize if I messed it up.
So, in your article, you talk about other forms of anti-competitive behavior in terms of business, conspiring with each other to hurt another business. What exactly is that called, and is that illegal?
Oh, that's a good question. So to clarify things for your listeners, the way that firms tighten their grip over the market, and when I say over the market, I mean not only over the market of products and services that they provide, but also around their workers and around their consumers, is through the use of anti-competitive tactics. And a lot of these anti-competitive tactics are, they present themselves in the form of contracts. So first of all, some of these contracts aren't real contracts. They're like vocal agreements precisely because they're illegal. So from like a lawyer's perspective, it's sometimes harder to prove that these agreements have in fact been made unless you can find like really explicit emails and things like that. But then there are also more legitimate contracts through which firms find ways to make it harder for consumers and workers to complain about their behavior, for workers to be able to find work elsewhere. So I'll give some more precise examples. On the labor side, there are non-compete agreements where your company says that if you leave our company, you cannot work. You essentially commit to not working for our competitors for a year after you leave. And so that's asking a lot out of people. I mean, it's asking people to change industries or to take a job that is much less interesting than the job they have now, or maybe to pass on more money at a competing firm because you're subject to this non-compete agreement. There are also non-poaching agreements in which two competing companies make a kind of soft agreement with each other that they're not going to steal each other's best workers. There are price-fixing agreements where companies make deals with each other that they won't sell, like they're both in the same industry and they kind of agree that they won't sell you airplane tickets between New York and DC for less than $300. So that the floor is kind of higher for consumers, and even if like these companies are sort of competing with each other, but not really, because they know that in the worst case scenario, they're going to make at least $300 off of it. And then there are also arbitration clauses, which we have written a lot about at Current Affairs. And these arbitration clauses are often fine print in employment contracts or in the sort of disclosure contracts that might come with a product or service that you buy, that basically says if you have a problem with the service that you received, or if you have a sexual harassment complaint against this employer, you essentially are forfeiting your right to take it to court and to adjudicate your claim before a judge. And instead, you're going to go into this dark room with us and go through the arbitration process with a non-judge arbiter of our choice who will decide who is right and who is wrong in this dispute. And as you can imagine, that screws over both workers and consumers. It takes away from them the option to kind of group up and, for instance, adjudicate their claim through a class action. And it's not static, right? Like, if you have a more pro-business court, like we have had a really pro-business Supreme Court for the last few decades, it ends up affecting the market greatly. So these arbitration clauses, I think there was a time, like there are lots of arguments that can be made that these are unconscionable and that it's ridiculous to force people to give up their rights to adjudicate their claims in court. And it's ridiculous to pretend that people are reading tiny, tiny print before they sign their employment contract or before they buy, any sort of service, really. But so I think there are arguments to make that those shouldn't be enforceable. But if the courts are friendly enough, we end up adopting them as part of our system, really, and then it's just really hard to get rid of them. So to the question of whether they're legal, it's like, yeah, right now they are. I don't think they should be. I think there are lots of arguments that many of these anti-competitive tactics should not be legal. But in the kind of legal climate that we're in now, they are. Many of them are. But we still have, the Sherman and Clayton Act and some state statutes do prohibit price fixing, which is kind of more low-hanging fruit in the antitrust world. So there are still some things that aren't legal, but it's all shifting. It really depends on what your courts look like, and thus far American courts are pretty pro-business and pretty conservative.
Okay, you just recently referenced state laws, and that's actually what I wanted to get to. So how do states get involved in preventing monopolies if the federal government won't?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. So first of all, some states do have antitrust laws on the books. For instance, New York State and California, which is good because these are pretty powerful states, and these are states in which a lot of business is anchored. But, it seems to me that the bulk of the antitrust action is really at the federal level. But I do think that, states can still provide more protections to labor to avoid or at least mitigate some of the worst effects of concentrated market power. I think they could make it easier for workers to unionize. They could raise the minimum wage laws so that if one firm becomes the only game in town, they can only squeeze their workers so much. We can sort of raise the minimum bar of what people can expect out of their employer. And, they can also make it more expensive to be a large corporation in their state, which may make firms think twice about merging. But even the problem with that is that sometimes the prospect of the profits that can be gained from merging are sort of worth, the immediate loss in maybe facing higher taxes the following year after a merger, in a kind of less business-friendly state. So I'm not even sure how effective that approach would be. To be honest, I'm basically reaching because to me, the antitrust world, that prospect seems a little bleak at this point in terms of the real reforms that can be achieved. But I also feel like we live in pretty exciting times. We have our own generation of burgeoning superstars in this field, in the law, in economics. People so when I was doing research for this essay, I did a lot of reading based on the research of people like Lena Khan, who is now at the SEC, and Sandeep Bahisan, who is at the Open Markets Institute. There's also Marshall Steinbaum, who is at the Roosevelt Institute. There are people who spend a lot of time thinking about concentrated market power and who have really great ideas. And then you sort of pair that with the kind of despair that I think has been brought on by the current political times and the current economy. And I think that despair is precisely what may lead many people, including nice, centrist, boring liberals, to be really open-minded to more radical proposals. Just because the last century is proof enough that whatever we're doing, it's not enough,
So, what in your opinion are some laws that we could pass to stop this trend of mergers?
I think that, so again, I have to reiterate that I am far from being an expert in this field, but my hunch is that we need a system that considers the effects of concentrating market power on labor. I think that's key, in part because when the Sherman and the Clayton Acts were passed, unions were far more powerful in this country. And since then, as a result of several congressional statutes and Supreme Court decisions, labor in this country is really weakened. So it would be one thing if we had these powerful corporations on the one end, but also had these powerful labor unions on the other end, so that there would, so we would be able to have a sort of more equal-footed negotiation stance. But right now we don't have that. So I think we need a system that both considers the effects of market power concentration on labor, but we also need to strengthen, we need to unwind bad precedent by being more explicit about protecting labor in the Antitrust Act statutes. But I think we need a path to really revive labor, which sounds like the kind of thing that you could do if you had a left-of-center president and maybe also a left-of-center Congress to work with. I also think another important aspect of this is, I think there are countries in the EU that have consumer lobbies, and we don't really have that right now. But I think, if you can imagine a well-funded lobby whose goal was to protect consumers across various industries, a group that was able to really just look at the effects of particular mergers and acquisitions and be able to voice concerns, to be able to ask questions about, well, what does this mean for the people who you expect to buy these products or services? You know, like if this goes through, what does that mean for average folks, basically? I mean, that's kind of the same mentality that led to the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right? Like the authority of that particular federal agency was drawn from a lot of the statutes that it enforces were previously enforced by other financial sector federal agencies. And what we found is that the SEC had a lot of considerations to take when it was, you know, doing its duties, and often consumers fell to the wayside. You could say the same with, like, the office of the controller of the currency. You could say the same with they call the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And so the idea was that, well, we're going to create one agency that has one focus, and that's consumers. And like that will be the driving force behind everything we do. Like I think we could do that on the antitrust side as well. So I mean, I think that that's maybe one way to lead to reform, and also really just we need to appoint people to these agencies, people who aren't afraid of being aggressive, you know, in actually doing to block mergers or to break up trust in a way that we haven't really seen since, like, the early days of the Sherman and Clayton Act. But, you know, I say this with, like, a grain of salt because even in the early days of the statute, for instance, I found a statistic that said that between 1914 and 1950, neither DOJ nor the FTC sued to stop any mergers, you know, which is, like, really surprising, but it's also kind of a giveaway that, like, we may feel like enforcement is fading, but it was never that strong to begin with. So it's sort of going back to the drawing board, going back to the legislative history of these statutes, and really, like, committing to enforcing them in a way that we haven't.
You mentioned earlier that you felt like there's rising voices that are talking about this. Do you see anyone in Congress that you think are really going at this problem, that are addressing it and talking about it?
I think that Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont have been pretty vocal. And I would say Elizabeth Warren in particular. And she's been able to, you know, she is a bankruptcy expert. She used to be a law professor. She used to teach at Harvard Law School. She used to teach contracts. Like, she has a wealth of knowledge that allows her to be very purposeful and very specific in the demands that she makes, in the questions that she even asks whenever she holds these hearings and makes these corporate CEOs come down to Washington, D.C. and answer to her and answer for their sins. But, you know, those are the names that come to mind to me. There are other Democrats who are kind of firebrands, but it's, you know, there's being a firebrand and then there's having the expertise to talk about these issues in a way that is really clear and well-informed. And I think that very few people in Congress have that.
I kind of want to follow up on that. So could you explain a little bit better to me what you mean between firebrand and just expert? What would you define as a firebrand?
Well, I think Maxine Waters is great. Like, she's energetic. Like, I feel like her heart is in the right place. Like, I think she thinks about consumers a lot. I mean, I think she's done a lot to call out the current administration where it has seemed like it was putting corporations over people. But Maxine Waters is not a law professor. Maxine Waters has not helped write, you know, a treatise on bankruptcy. And you can tell, you know, and so I think it sort of shapes the narrative. And to be fair, I mean, I'm not kidding myself, right? Like, I know that a lot of these politicians, part of what I think makes people good leaders is being able to surround yourself with policy wonks who can put your ideas down, who can get down to the nitty-gritty and shape your ideas into what ends up becoming laws or regulations. I'm not kidding myself that most senators aren't necessarily in the weeds of the bills that they help put forward. But I do think it makes a difference in their ability to really nail down people who do wrong. For instance, in these hearings, it makes a huge difference if they have a wealth of knowledge in a particular area. And so I wish I could remember the specific hearings, but I feel like sometime in the last couple of years, I remember, I think it was the confirmation hearing for either the acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or of Treasury. And I remember thinking that some of the questions that were being asked, or some of the follow-up questions that these senators were asking of the person being up for confirmation, reflected a kind of lack of knowledge of the specific, area of finance. So
I'd like to thank Vanessa for taking time out of her busy schedule to do this interview with me. If you're interested in hearing more of Vanessa's thoughts on a variety of subjects as I am, you can always follow her on Twitter and catch her on the Current Affairs podcast, both of which are linked below. Thank you.